May 20th, 1985, Norfolk, Virginia. At 2:32 in the morning, Naval Investigative Service agents finalize an internal brief estimating that a single compromised communications key, known in Navy terminology as a KL-47 encryption variable, could expose up to 1.5 million naval messages per year. The assessment concludes that if such a key were continuously passed to a foreign intelligence service, the U.S. Navy's Atlantic submarine force would operate with procedurally predictable vulnerability. 4 hours later, the FBI's counterintelligence division informs the Department of the Navy that recently intercepted communications referenced an American naval insider with access to precisely these keys. Analysts compare the material with encrypted Soviet traffic and recognize matching signatures. For the first time, U.S. authorities consider that the Soviet Union may have obtained long-term, systematic access to Navy cryptographic systems, a possibility that could reshape assessments of Soviet submarine tracking capability throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. What investigators still lack is the identity of the insider and the scope of his network. In this documentary, we will trace how a single chief warrant officer turned routine access into 18 years of undetected compromise, examine the technical systems that Soviet intelligence exploited, and compare Navy damage assessments with what declassified Soviet records later revealed about the operation's strategic impact. January 1967. USS Simon Lake, Rota, Spain. Radiomen load fresh KW-7 and KL-47 key lists into secure safes during routine communications turnover. The procedure represents normalcy in Cold War naval operations, trusted personnel handling classified materials according to established protocols, physical security measures preventing external intrusion, and institutional confidence that the system works as intended. The architecture underlying Navy communication security reflects assumptions developed during World War II and refined through the early Cold War. Physical control of cryptographic materials forms the foundation. Paper encryption keys arrive sealed in tamper-evident packages, distributed through controlled courier networks. Destruction schedules require witnesses and documentation. Locked safes in communications centers, staffed by personnel holding top-secret clearances, provide the final protection layer. The system emphasizes hardware secrecy over personnel vetting. The encryption devices themselves receive extraordinary protection. The mathematical algorithms are state secrets, but personnel operating these systems face less intensive ongoing scrutiny than the hardware they maintain. Background investigations occur at initial clearance, examining criminal history, financial stability, foreign contacts, and loyalty indicators. However, systematic reinvestigation programs remain inconsistent across the fleet. The prevailing philosophy assumes that loyalty among Navy personnel compensates for procedural gaps in key handling discipline. Sailors and officers are presumed to be patriots who will not betray their country regardless of opportunities. This assumption proves correct for the vast majority, but it creates vulnerability when applied universally. Declassified Inspector General audits from 1966 through 1967 reveal structural weaknesses. The audits cite irregular reinvestigation schedules, leaving some cleared personnel without updated background checks for 5 years or longer. They document uneven compliance with key destruction protocols, particularly aboard submarine tenders and at shore-based communications centers, where operational tempo competes with security procedures. Physical security measures, while robust against external intrusion, provide limited protection against insider compromise by personnel with legitimate access. Within this environment, Chief Warrant Officer John Anthony Walker moves through assigned duties with unremarkable efficiency. His position provides routine access to key lists that unlock encrypted naval communications, cryptographic maintenance instructions explaining system vulnerabilities, and communications logs revealing message volumes and routing patterns. Walker's background shows nothing raising security concerns. He is a Navy career professional with years of service, technical competence, and satisfactory performance evaluations. He appears to be exactly what the Navy needs: reliable, technically skilled, and trusted to handle sensitive materials. At some point during this period, Walker contacts the KGB's Baltimore residency. The exact date remains unclear, though Soviet archival sources suggest late 1967. His motivation appears primarily financial rather than ideological. Walker initiates contact himself, rather than being recruited through traditional targeting. His first delivery consists of photocopied cryptographic materials. Soviet analysts immediately recognize them as operationally valuable. Walker demonstrates sophisticated understanding of what information matters and how to present it for maximum intelligence value. Soviet archival sources released after 1991 provide detail about KGB assessment of Walker's early material. The evaluation describes his initial delivery as demonstrating complete technical sufficiency for exploiting U.S. naval message traffic. The keys are current, properly formatted, and accompanied by contextual information enabling immediate operational use. Walker understands cryptographic systems at a level unusual for walk-in sources. He can explain which key lists correspond to which encryption devices, when keys will change, and which naval communications would be most valuable. What begins as isolated compromise of specific encryption keys soon expands into something more systematic. Walker recognizes that continuous access will be more valuable than one-time delivery. Soviet handlers understand that cultivating Walker as a long-term source offers strategic advantages. The foundation is being laid for what will become the longest-running and most damaging naval espionage operation in American history. A systemic reliance on manual discipline enables breach potential that will remain undetected for nearly 2 decades. Between 1968 and 1970, U.S. Navy communication security operates with confidence, reflecting 2 decades of Cold War experience. At naval communication stations in Charleston and Norfolk, teletype machines print encrypted fleet messages using KL-47 key sets. The system generates millions of transmissions, annually coordinating submarine movements, surface fleet operations, carrier deployments, and strategic deterrence patrols. The technical systems represent sophisticated Cold War cryptography. The KW-7, known formally as TSE KW-7, is an offline encryption device used for point-to-point secure communications between ships and shore stations. The system employs rotor-based encryption technology with Cold War-era electronics, providing significantly stronger security than World War II predecessors. Each device requires physical key lists, setting initial rotor positions and determining encryption variables that scramble plain text into unreadable ciphertext. The KL-47 provides encryption variables changing according to scheduled key lists distributed throughout the Navy's communications network. The system is designed so that even if adversaries intercept encrypted transmissions, mathematical complexity combined with frequently changing keys renders decryption practically impossible without physical access to both encryption device and current key materials. The theory is sound. The encryption algorithms are mathematically robust. The vulnerability lies not in mathematics, but in human systems protecting the keys. The KWR-37 handles satellite broadcast communications, enabling fleet-wide message distribution across vast oceanic distances. This system allows simultaneous transmission of orders, intelligence updates, and administrative traffic to multiple recipients across global operations. A single encrypted broadcast can reach submarines in the Atlantic, carriers in the Western Pacific, amphibious forces in the Mediterranean, and logistics ships in the Indian Ocean. The efficiency is extraordinary, but it creates security implications once keys are compromised. The volume of naval message traffic during the late 1960s reflects operational tempo, distinguishing the U.S. Navy from any other maritime force. Atlantic Fleet submarine forces conduct continuous strategic deterrence patrols. Ballistic missile submarines maintain at-sea presence, ensuring survivable second strike capability. Pacific Fleet operations generate comparable volumes, supporting carrier battle groups, surface action groups, and amphibious forces. Mediterranean deployments, Indian Ocean patrols, and Arctic surveillance missions all depend on communication security, presuming cryptographic key protection. National Security Agency assessments from this period, declassified decades later, note over-reliance on physical key distribution as potential vulnerability. The assessments recommend transitioning toward electronic key generation and distribution systems, reducing human handling and creating robust audit trails. Implementation proceeds slowly. Existing systems work reliably. Replacement costs are substantial, and no confirmed compromise has been detected, justifying urgent modernization. The contrast between U.S. confidence in operational security and Soviet ability to interpret message structures is stark. American communications planners believe that even if adversaries intercept encrypted transmissions, mathematical complexity and secure key distribution render decryption practically impossible. This assessment is technically correct. Soviet cryptanalysts cannot break U.S. Navy encryption through purely analytical methods, but the assessment fails to account for physical access to key materials achieved through insider compromise. Soviet intercept stations collect U.S. naval communications across multiple frequencies. Without encryption keys, intercepted traffic appears as mathematically scrambled data, offering no intelligence value beyond traffic analysis. Navy and NSA communications security inspection findings from 1969 show procedural weaknesses that officials consider manageable risks rather than critical vulnerabilities. Key handling discipline varies across commands. Background reinvestigations occur inconsistently. Physical security focuses on preventing unauthorized access by outsiders, but provides limited protection against insiders with legitimate clearances. Soviet intercept stations begin correlating decrypted metadata with U.S. submarine movements, developing capability that American intelligence will not detect for more than a decade. From 1970 through 1974, John Walker's career trajectory provides continuous access to communications security materials across multiple commands. His transfers and promotions allow him to maintain uninterrupted flow of encryption keys, operating manuals, and fleet movement schedules to Soviet handlers. The continuity transforms what might have been limited duration compromise into systematic penetration spanning years. Walker logs into communications centers at Norfolk and Atlantic Fleet Command units. His duties include retrieving updated routing indicators, revealing how the Navy structures global message traffic. His responsibilities extend to maintenance of cryptographic equipment, providing legitimate access to technical manuals, explaining system vulnerabilities, and troubleshooting techniques. He processes message logs, documenting communication patterns and organizational structure of Navy communications networks. The roles enabling Walker's access appear entirely legitimate to security officials conducting periodic inspections. Walker holds appropriate clearances properly granted through established procedures. His duties require handling classified communications security materials. His performance evaluations show competent execution of responsibilities. Nothing in observable professional conduct suggests systematic betrayal. Walker's personal life shows some indicators that might warrant closer examination in retrospect. His financial situation fluctuates in ways his Navy salary does not entirely explain. He makes investments and purchases inconsistent with documented income. However, these indicators are not dramatic enough to trigger security reviews in an era when financial monitoring of cleared personnel is less systematic. Central Intelligence Agency damage assessments prepared years later determine that encryption keys Walker provides during this period allow Soviet analysts to break multiple cipher types simultaneously. The keys span the range of devices used across the fleet: KW7 for point-to-point communications, KL47 for fleet messaging, KWR37 for satellite broadcasts. This comprehensive access means Soviet signals intelligence can decrypt not just isolated communications, but entire networks of related messages. The capability to decrypt multiple related messages simultaneously provides context, transforming isolated information into comprehensive intelligence. A submarine movement order, decrypted alone, might reveal where one vessel is going. Combined with decrypted logistics messages, maintenance schedules, and status reports, the same order becomes part of a larger operational picture showing how submarine forces are positioned and what missions they conduct. Public perception during the early 1970s sees U.S. Navy dominance at sea as unquestioned. American carrier battle groups operate globally with apparent impunity. Submarine forces maintain strategic deterrence patrols, forming the survivable leg of the nuclear triad. Surface combatants control sea lanes and project power ashore. The classified reality, unknown to policymakers and military planners, is that an adversary is gaining consistent insight into fleet communications, undermining operational effectiveness in ways that will only become apparent through retrospective analysis. Soviet naval commanders begin showing improved interception accuracy that American intelligence analysts note but cannot adequately explain through conventional analysis of Soviet technological capabilities. The pattern appears across multiple warfare areas and geographic theaters. Soviet submarines position themselves along projected U.S. transit routes with uncanny accuracy. Soviet surface forces appear at exercise areas earlier than random patrol patterns would explain. Each individual incident has plausible explanations, but the cumulative pattern suggests something more systematic that analysts cannot identify. Soviet naval commanders are showing improved interception accuracy that will only become more pronounced in the following decade. In 1974, within secure facilities operated by the KGB's First Chief Directorate in Moscow, Directorate T analysts input decrypted U.S. naval traffic into ES-1040 mainframe computers for systematic analysis. The Directorate T division specializes in scientific and technical intelligence. Walker's material represents precisely the kind of sustained, high-quality source enabling long-term strategic advantage rather than merely tactical gains. Soviet intelligence classifies Walker as a stable, ongoing source whose reliability and access make him exceptionally valuable. Unlike agents providing sporadic reporting, Walker delivers current encryption keys with predictable regularity, allowing Soviet intelligence to plan collection operations with confidence. His material enables real-time exploitation rather than historical analysis of outdated communications. The assessment of Walker as stable reflects several factors. He has maintained operational security sufficient to avoid detection for years. He has continued providing material through Navy transfers and position changes. He has never exhibited behavior suggesting he might be a double agent. The consistency and quality of his deliveries establish confidence that he is genuine and worthy of sustained investment. The signals intelligence exploitation process that FAPSI, the Soviet Signals Intelligence Directorate, implements using Walker's keys is methodical and comprehensive. Soviet intercept stations positioned across the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and aboard intelligence collection ships collect U.S. naval communications across multiple frequency bands. These raw intercepts, accumulated in massive volumes daily, had previously been useful primarily for traffic analysis. With Walker's encryption keys, raw intercepts become readable communications, revealing operational intelligence of extraordinary value. FAPSI analysts can decrypt submarine movement orders, surface fleet coordination, logistics planning, exercise scenarios, and weapons testing results. The decrypted material is correlated with observed U.S. submarine patrol patterns, surface ship movements identified through reconnaissance satellites, and exercise activities monitored through signals intelligence. The correlation process reveals operational intelligence that no single source can provide in isolation. Decrypted movement orders show where submarines are being directed. Visual or acoustic observation confirms actual movements. The combination validates the intelligence and provides comprehensive situational awareness of U.S. naval deployments. Soviet submarine commanders receive information about U.S. ballistic missile submarine patrol areas. They obtain transit routes, revealing how U.S. submarines move between bases and patrol areas. They learn communication schedules, indicating when submarines will be transmitting. Surface fleet movements become predictable through decrypted logistics coordination and operational orders. Exercise scenarios can now be understood in advance through decrypted planning messages. Weapons testing becomes visible through decrypted test schedules and results reporting. The contrast between U.S. perception of Soviet anti-submarine warfare limits and archival reality is striking. American naval intelligence assesses Soviet ASW capabilities as improving through better sonar technology and enhanced signal processing. But assessments conclude that Soviet forces remain fundamentally limited by technological constraints, preventing them from effectively tracking quiet U.S. submarines. What assessments miss entirely is that Soviet forces are compensating for technological limitations through signals intelligence, revealing exactly where to position assets for maximum effectiveness. A Soviet submarine commander who knows from decrypted communications that a U.S. ballistic missile submarine will transit a particular area during a specific time window can concentrate sensors optimally. This focused deployment is far more effective than random patrol patterns. The intelligence advantage extends beyond tactical operations to strategic planning. Soviet military planners can assess U.S. naval capabilities, deployment patterns, and operational doctrine through systematic analysis of decrypted communications accumulated over months and years. Moscow instructs Walker to expand his sources, a directive reflecting Soviet intelligence assessment that Walker possesses recruitment potential beyond his own access. Between 1975 and 1976, John Walker recruits his brother, Arthur Walker, expanding the espionage network into the defense contractor sector. Arthur works at VSE Corporation in Chesapeake, Virginia, a company holding contracts supporting Navy engineering and maintenance programs. His position grants access to classified submarine systems data, maintenance manuals, and technical evaluations. The contractor engineering office where Arthur works handles restricted documents detailing submarine capabilities ranging from propulsion and acoustic signatures to weapon systems and electronic warfare. These materials, while not communications related, offer technical understanding that enhances Soviet ability to exploit operational intelligence derived from decrypted messages. VSE Corporation's contracts include maintenance planning, systems evaluation, technical training development, and engineering support for submarine forces. Arthur's position involves handling classified documentation, explaining how systems function, what maintenance procedures are required, what failure modes might occur, and what performance parameters define acceptable operation. Documents recovered during the eventual investigation include system evaluations, assessing submarine performance under various operational conditions. Training manuals explain crew procedures, system limitations, and emergency responses. Engineering analyses examine design compromises, performance trade-offs, and vulnerabilities inherent in submarine construction. Soviet use of contractor-derived engineering data refines understanding of U.S. submarine capabilities in ways that pure communications intelligence cannot achieve. Knowing where a submarine is operating matters far more when combined with knowledge of acoustic signature, maximum dive depth, weapons systems, and operational limitations. The technical intelligence allows Soviet submarine commanders to develop tactics tailored to specific U.S. submarine classes. A Los Angeles-class attack submarine has different characteristics than a Sturgeon-class boat. Knowing these differences allows Soviet forces to employ different detection strategies. The recruitment of Arthur Walker represents operational expansion that Soviet handlers explicitly encouraged. John's instruction to develop additional sources reflects KGB assessment that network operations offer advantages over single-source penetration. Multiple sources provide redundancy, breadth of coverage, and opportunities for cross-validation. Arthur's motivation appears primarily financial, similar to John's original motivation. The family relationship allows John to approach Arthur, assess receptiveness, and develop him as a source without formal KGB involvement in initial stages. This family-based recruitment reduces counterintelligence risk. Financial compensation Arthur receives is substantial enough to motivate continued cooperation, but not so dramatic as to create lifestyle changes attracting attention. Soviet handlers understand that sudden wealth among sources with modest incomes could trigger counterintelligence investigations. Payments are delivered in cash through John, who serves as intermediary, maintaining operational security by limiting Arthur's direct contact with intelligence officers. The integration of Arthur's technical intelligence with John's communications intelligence creates synergies, enhancing the value of both sources. Decrypted operational messages gain additional meaning when understood in context of technical capabilities. Technical data becomes more applicable when combined with current operational intelligence. Classified technical specifications now align with decrypted operational traffic, multiplying intelligence value in ways Soviet analysts exploit to refine understanding and develop countermeasures. From 1977 through 1980, Jerry Whitworth, a former Navy communications specialist recruited by John Walker, supplies high-grade keying material from the Naval Communications Center in Alameda, California. Whitworth's position provides access to KWR-37 satellite broadcast keys, enabling exploitation of fleet-wide communications transmitted via satellite links. The satellite broadcast system represents the Navy's primary method for disseminating operational orders, intelligence updates, logistics coordination, and administrative traffic to deployed forces worldwide. The system's efficiency, allowing simultaneous transmission to multiple recipients across vast distances, makes it operationally invaluable but creates security vulnerability if encryption keys are compromised. Whitworth prepares satellite key cards for transmission as part of normal duties, giving him undetected access to materials, unlocking continuous streams of fleet broadcast traffic. His duties are routine, his access legitimate, and his handling of key materials entirely consistent with assigned responsibilities. Nothing appears suspicious or warrants investigation. The key cards he provides to Walker enable continuous Soviet exploitation of Pacific Fleet broadcasts during periods when Whitworth has access to current materials. Department of Justice damage assessments confirm that Soviet intelligence gains sustained access to U.S. fleet broadcasts during this period. The geographic separation between Walker's Atlantic Fleet access and Whitworth's Pacific Fleet position creates comprehensive coverage, allowing Soviet intelligence to monitor U.S. naval operations across both major oceanic theaters simultaneously. This breadth means Soviet planners can develop global situational awareness rather than partial pictures limited to single theaters. Whitworth's technical knowledge exceeds Walker's in some areas, reflecting extended service in communications specialties. He understands how encryption systems function at detailed technical levels, what vulnerabilities exist, and how operational procedures either enhance or degrade security. This expertise makes his reporting more valuable to Soviet analysts. The contrast between how American intelligence explains Soviet naval advances and the actual source is profound. U.S. analysts attribute improved Soviet submarine tracking to advances in passive sonar technology, better oceanographic modeling, and enhanced signal processing capabilities. While Soviet systems are improving in these technological areas, the dramatic effectiveness comes primarily from knowing where U.S. submarines will be operating based on decrypted movement orders. The misattribution leads American naval planners to invest billions in acoustic quieting programs designed to make U.S. submarines harder to detect through sonar. These programs succeed in producing quieter submarines, but they address a technological challenge while missing the intelligence vulnerability actually enabling Soviet tracking. Soviet submarines shadow U.S. carrier groups with heightened precision during exercises and deployments. American intelligence officers note these patterns but explain them through improved Soviet reconnaissance. The explanation is partially correct, but it misses the communications intelligence, providing direct access to operational plans. Whitworth's financial situation improves during the period when he provides material, though not so dramatically as to attract immediate attention. He makes investments and purchases exceeding what his Navy salary alone would support. In retrospect, these financial indicators might have warranted closer examination. The recruitment of Whitworth demonstrates Walker's capability as a spotter and developer of sources, skills KGB handlers value highly. Soviet submarines are shadowing U.S. carrier groups with precision that should be impossible without advance intelligence. Between 1978 and 1982, Michael Walker, John Walker's son, expands the network's penetration to shipboard operations aboard the USS Nimitz. The carrier's communications center handles enormous encrypted message loads, coordinating air-wing operations, battle group movements, and logistics support. Michael Walker's role as radio man provides access to message fragments revealing operational planning, key logs documenting which encryption systems are used for different traffic types, and communication summaries showing message volumes and routing patterns. His shipboard access reveals how communications flow during operational deployments in ways shore-based sources cannot observe directly. His presence aboard a deployed carrier allows him to observe integration of communications with actual operations. He can see how message traffic increases before flight operations, what communications precede underway replenishments, and how the battle group coordinates defensive responses during exercises. This operational context enhances intelligence value of technical materials other network sources provide. The combined effect of multiple sources operating simultaneously across different Navy commands eliminates residual cryptographic protection that might survive compromise of any single element. With sources at shore stations providing encryption keys and a source aboard a deployed carrier showing how systems operate in practice, Soviet analysts can cross-reference information, verify accuracy, and eliminate ambiguities. Soviet analysts cross-reference decrypted communications from multiple collection points, comparing messages intercepted from different sources to verify decryption works correctly and information is authentic. They can identify when key changes or procedural modifications occur that might temporarily interrupt access. During NATO exercises in the early 1980s, Alliance intelligence officers note patterns suggesting Soviet units possess advanced knowledge of NATO force movements. Soviet submarines seem to arrive early at locations where NATO exercises will occur. Soviet intelligence collection ships station themselves optimally to observe exercises. Soviet surface forces demonstrate tactical responses that seem tailored to specific NATO scenarios. Alliance commanders propose various explanations for Soviet effectiveness. Some suggest Soviet reconnaissance satellites provide better intelligence. Others propose Soviet human intelligence sources might have penetrated NATO planning staffs. Still others argue Soviet forces have improved analytical capabilities. Each explanation has plausibility, but they miss the most significant factor: systematic access to NATO naval communications through compromised encryption keys. Classified anomalies emerge in Naval Investigative Service internal reports compiled during the early 1980s. The reports note unexplained Soviet operational effectiveness inconsistent with assessed technological capabilities. They document patterns suggesting possible intelligence compromise without identifying specific sources. They recommend enhanced security measures, though recommendations are implemented inconsistently. NIS analysts preparing these reports observe genuine indicators of ongoing espionage, but they lack evidence and context necessary to identify specific compromise. Security reviews examine procedures and investigate incidents without discovering the network operating beneath the surface. Michael Walker's participation represents generational expansion of espionage that Soviet handlers find remarkable. Family-based networks offer operational security advantages. Recruitment occurs within trusted relationships. Communications between family members appear natural, and shared commitment creates redundancy. The pattern of Soviet forces arriving early at intercept locations continues, unexplained, until Barbara Walker's disclosure initiates the investigation that will finally unravel the network. From 1980 through 1984, the U.S. Navy invests billions in systems designed to counter Soviet submarine capabilities that are, in reality, enhanced primarily through compromised communications. P-3 Orion squadrons launch anti-submarine warfare patrols amid increased Soviet activity, deploying sophisticated acoustic sensors and processing systems intended to detect quieter Soviet submarines. The SOSUS acoustic surveillance system, a network of underwater listening posts spanning the Atlantic and Pacific, undergoes extensive upgrades to improve sensitivity and coverage. The program cost reflects assumptions that Soviet submarines are becoming quieter through improved propulsion systems and hull design. While Soviet submarine technology is advancing, the primary reason for decreased detection rates is that Soviet commanders know patrol patterns and can avoid SOSUS coverage based on decrypted operational orders. Acoustic quieting programs for U.S. submarines consume substantial research and development budgets. Driven by concerns that Soviet ASW capabilities are improving at rates threatening the survivability of American ballistic missile submarines. Pentagon reviews reveal increasing Soviet accuracy in tracking U.S. submarine movements, but the reviews explain this through technological improvements in Soviet sonar systems rather than considering communications compromise. Soviet exploitation of decrypted fleet broadcasts and patrol orders provides submarine commanders with operational intelligence that no amount of sonar improvement can match. Knowing the search area, patrol schedule, and communication windows for a U.S. submarine reduces the tracking problem from searching millions of cubic miles of ocean to monitoring a relatively confined area during predictable time periods. The misattribution of Soviet effectiveness to technology leads to resource allocation decisions addressing symptoms rather than causes. The United States spends billions upgrading systems that are performing as designed, never recognizing that vulnerability lies in compromised communication security rather than inadequate anti-submarine warfare capabilities. Investigators notice unexplained patterns in Soviet naval operations, suggesting access to U.S. planning information. But patterns are not dramatic enough to trigger comprehensive security reviews that might identify ongoing compromise. The Navy's confidence in its communications security, combined with absence of direct evidence pointing to specific compromise, allows the espionage to continue. By 1983, the Walker spy ring has been operating for approximately 16 years without detection. The network has provided Soviet intelligence with continuous access to U.S. Navy encryption keys, technical documentation, and operational intelligence across multiple commands and geographic theaters. The strategic impact is substantial, though American counterintelligence has not yet recognized the full extent of the compromise. The turning point will come not through systematic counterintelligence investigation, but through personal disclosure from someone with direct knowledge of the espionage operation. If you value factual Cold War history, consider supporting Cold War files. In November 1984, the decisive turning point comes when John Walker's ex-wife, Barbara Walker, provides a detailed account of his espionage activities to federal authorities in Norfolk, Virginia. The Naval Investigative Service interview room becomes the setting for allegations that initially seem almost too comprehensive to be credible. Barbara Walker provides specific dates when she observed John photographing documents. She names individuals he mentioned as participants in the operation. She describes materials she saw in their home: camera equipment, stacks of documents marked with security classifications, and cash payments exceeding what John's Navy salary could explain. Her statements align with known communications security anomalies that have puzzled counterintelligence analysts for years. Patterns of Soviet operational effectiveness, previously attributed to technological advancement, now appear potentially explainable through compromised encryption keys. Financial irregularities in John Walker's bank records match time frames Barbara describes for cash payments from Soviet handlers. Initial skepticism among investigators, ex-spouse allegations are sometimes motivated by personal grievances, gives way to evidence-based corroboration as each element of Barbara Walker's account proves verifiable through independent sources. FBI Counterintelligence Division assumes operational control of what has become a potentially explosive espionage investigation with implications reaching the highest levels of naval operations. The decision to pursue the investigation reflects assessment that Barbara Walker's information, despite coming from a potentially biased source, contains sufficient specific detail and aligns with enough independent indicators to warrant full counterintelligence mobilization. Investigators begin systematic review of John Walker's financial records, employment history, travel patterns, and personal associations. They examined communication security logs to determine what materials he had access to during various assignments. They reconstruct his career trajectory to identify which cryptographic systems and operational commands he had contact with over nearly 2 decades of Navy service. The investigation expands to include surveillance operations designed to document Walker's current activities and identify co-conspirators. FBI surveillance teams establish monitoring positions, allowing them to observe Walker's movements, communications, and contacts without revealing the investigation's existence. The surveillance must be conducted carefully to avoid alerting Walker that he is under investigation, which might prompt him to cease espionage activities, destroy evidence, or flee. Barbara Walker's cooperation provides investigators with operational details they could not easily obtain through surveillance alone. She describes meeting locations where John conducted exchanges with Soviet handlers. She explains tradecraft techniques he employed to avoid detection. She identifies time periods when espionage activity was most intensive. This insider knowledge allows investigators to focus resources on the most productive investigative avenues rather than conducting broad searches hoping to identify relevant patterns. The disclosure represents a vulnerability inherent in any long-term espionage operation, personal relationships that might deteriorate and create disgruntled individuals with detailed knowledge of classified activities. Soviet intelligence training emphasizes limiting family members' knowledge of espionage activities precisely to prevent this risk. However, Walker's long-term operation, sustained over years of marriage, made it difficult to completely conceal his activities from his wife. FBI Counterintelligence Division assumes operational control, transforming vague suspicions into focused investigation targeting specific individuals. From late 1984 through early 1985, FBI surveillance teams in Washington, D.C. and Maryland document John Walker conducting counter-surveillance loops characteristic of trained intelligence operatives. Surveillance logs record him driving circuitous routes designed to identify following vehicles, making unexpected stops and reversals, and using public transportation in patterns meant to break visual surveillance. Federal monitoring of Walker's communications, conducted under court authorization, reveals contacts with individuals whose backgrounds suggest intelligence connections. His travel patterns include trips to locations with no apparent legitimate purpose related to documented employment or personal relationships. Dead-drop behaviors, leaving materials at concealed locations for pickup without direct contact, match KGB tradecraft documented in other counterintelligence cases. The collection of photographic and physical evidence proceeds methodically. Surveillance teams document Walker's movements without revealing their presence. Technical surveillance captures communications that will later be used as evidence. Financial investigators trace fund flows through banks and identify unexplained income that Walker's legitimate employment cannot account for. The investigation identifies Jerry Whitworth in California, Arthur Walker in Virginia, and Michael Walker as probable co-conspirators based on information from Barbara Walker and patterns observed through surveillance. Investigators develop evidence packages on each individual, documenting their access to classified materials, their contacts with John Walker, and financial patterns suggesting compensation for espionage activities. Coordination between FBI field officers ensures that when arrests occur, they can be executed simultaneously to prevent any conspirator from warning others. The planning reflects lessons learned from previous counterintelligence investigations, where sequential arrests allowed subsequent targets to flee or destroy evidence. Investigators face the challenge of building prosecutable cases while protecting intelligence sources and methods. Some evidence derives from signals intelligence or other classified programs that cannot be fully revealed in court without compromising ongoing operations. Prosecutors must determine which evidence can be presented publicly and which must remain classified, while still building cases meeting criminal standards for espionage prosecution. A scheduled dead drop in May 1985 provides actionable grounds for arrest, allowing investigators to seize Walker with physical evidence in his possession, eliminating any defense argument that evidence was planted or that Walker was not actually engaged in active espionage at the time of arrest. On May 20th, 1985, in Montgomery County, Maryland, John Walker approaches a concealed drop site carrying materials confirming 18 years of systematic compromise. FBI agents wait until he deposits a package at the predetermined location before moving in to execute the arrest warrant. Coordinated operations simultaneously neutralize Jerry Whitworth in California, Arthur Walker in Virginia, and Michael Walker aboard the USS Nimitz. The coordination ensures no conspirator receives warning that might allow destruction of evidence or flight to avoid arrest. Evidence seizure yields cipher key lists current as of days before the arrest, routing indicators revealing communications network structure, and photocopies of classified message traffic. The materials provide conclusive proof that compromise has been ongoing and active rather than historical. Pentagon damage assessments begin immediately, drawing on counterintelligence files, technical evaluations of compromised systems, and reconstructions of what information Walker and co-conspirators had possessed access to during respective periods of espionage activity. The preliminary conclusions are devastating. The assessments calculate that Walker's operation represents the most damaging naval espionage case of the Cold War, surpassing previous cases in scope, duration, and strategic impact. 18 years of continuous access to encryption keys has provided Soviet intelligence with sustained visibility into U.S. naval operations across multiple theaters. Measurable impact on U.S. submarine survivability becomes apparent as analysts reconstruct what Soviet forces could have known about ballistic missile submarine patrols, attack submarine deployments, and acoustic characteristics. The survivability margin that strategic deterrence doctrine depends upon has been eroded without American awareness. Message security across the fleet requires complete overhaul. Every communication system Walker touched, and given his positions and duration of access, that includes virtually all major Navy cryptographic systems, requires assumption of compromise and replacement. Strategic assessments of Soviet tracking capability throughout the 1970s and early 1980s need fundamental revision. Capabilities attributed to technological advancement are now understood as deriving substantially from signals intelligence exploitation. Damage estimates begin to quantify long-term exposure, measured not in isolated incidents, but in millions of compromised messages spanning nearly 2 decades of Cold War naval operations. Between 1985 and 1991, the Pentagon and National Security Agency undertake comprehensive reviews to assess strategic and doctrinal consequences of the Walker Compromise. Damage reports outline extensive penetration across Atlantic and Pacific fleets, submarine forces, surface warfare communities, and communications networks considered secure. The U.S. Navy's response involves complete overhaul of its communications security architecture. The transition to electronic key distribution eliminates manual handling that enabled Walker's photocopying of paper key lists. Multi-layered authentication protocols ensure that even personnel with legitimate access face additional verification requirements before handling the most sensitive materials. Communication security training undergoes revision to emphasize insider threat indicators and security culture rather than merely procedural compliance. The Walker case demonstrates that cleared, trusted personnel can betray their positions if ideological commitment or financial motivation overcomes loyalty. Training programs incorporate case studies showing how Walker exploited procedural weaknesses. Contractor oversight reforms address Arthur Walker's role, implementing stricter segregation between contractor personnel and classified Navy materials. The reforms require more rigorous background investigations for contractor employees and limit their access to operational data that could enhance communications intelligence value. Auditing protocols expand to create comprehensive logs of who accessed which materials during specific time periods. The protocols enable retrospective reconstruction of potential compromises and create deterrent effects by making unauthorized access more detectable. Soviet military historians, writing after the Cold War's conclusion, acknowledge that Walker's material offered unparalleled insight into U.S. naval planning. The assessments, published in Russian military journals during the 1990s, describe Walker as having provided operational intelligence, contributing significantly to Soviet strategic stability calculations during periods of heightened tension. During the 1973 Middle East crisis, Soviet commanders possessed detailed knowledge of U.S. naval dispositions through decrypted communications. During the 1983 period surrounding NATO's Able Archer exercise, Soviet intelligence used Walker's keys to monitor U.S. naval activities. The scale of compromise forces systemic modernization across the Department of Defense, extending far beyond Navy communications to influence how all services approach insider threat and communications security. In the post-1991 archival review era, as researchers gain access to declassified American materials and selected Soviet intelligence records, the full scope of the Walker spy ring comes into sharper focus. A National Security Agency summary from 1991 provides the authoritative assessment defining Walker's place in espionage history. The summary states, "No single spy before or after provided the Soviet Union with greater continuous access to U.S. naval communications." The assessment is based on comprehensive review comparing Walker's 18-year operation to other major Cold War espionage cases across all services and intelligence agencies. The long-term influence on Cold War naval doctrine extends through multiple dimensions. Submarine operations incorporate procedures assuming adversary awareness of patrol areas and communication schedules. Surface warfare doctrine adjusts to account for potentially compromised movement orders and exercise plans. Strategic deterrence planning faces uncomfortable questions about whether ballistic missile submarine survivability was maintained during the 1970s and 80s. Counterintelligence standards across the Department of Defense reflect lessons learned from the Walker investigation. The case becomes a central reference in insider threat training programs for personnel at all levels. The case illustrates how a single insider can exploit structural weaknesses inherent in any large-scale classified program. Walker possessed legitimate access, understood technical systems well enough to identify valuable information, maintained operational security sufficient to avoid detection for 18 years, and recruited additional sources who multiplied the damage beyond what any individual could achieve alone. The structural vulnerabilities he exploited: reliance on manual key distribution, inconsistent personnel security monitoring, procedural gaps between security policy and operational practice, and compartmentalization failures giving individual personnel excessive access, were not unique to the Navy but characterized classified programs across government. The reforms implemented after Walker's arrest represent attempts to address these systemic issues, though security professionals recognize that determined insiders with legitimate access will always pose residual risk that procedural safeguards can mitigate but never completely eliminate. The Walker case remains a foundational study in understanding how espionage operations achieve sustained access, what organizational vulnerabilities enable long-term compromise, and what strategic consequences flow from penetrated communications security. A single insider had exploited structural weaknesses across an entire command network, compromising the naval communications that enabled global operations and strategic deterrence. The damage would take years to assess fully and decades to remediate completely. If you value factual Cold War history, consider supporting Cold War Files,